Today is October the 6th. What's the most important thing for the church? Let's find out together as we read 1 Corinthians chapter 10 to chapter 14. As we've worked our way through 1 Corinthians, we saw how the first several chapters dealt with information that Paul had been given by those of the household of Chloe. The second part of 1 Corinthians dealt with Paul's answers to a letter that the Corinthian church had sent him. Beginning in chapter 10, Paul says, I don't want you to forget, dear brothers and sisters. Decent translation, but I love Paul's words in Greek. I don't want you to be ignorant. Paul says, I want you to know this. And Paul brings up several things that he wanted to mention. This was not brought to him by Chloe. This was not something that they wrote to him about. This is something that as Paul, in his apostolic position, looks at the church in Corinth, he says, there are three things that I want to talk to you about. The first of them is idolatry. Corinth was a city that was full of pagan idols, and it would be all too easy, especially for the Gentile believers, to simply accept Jesus as another idol, another God among the ones that they had. So Paul makes a point of saying, follow Jesus only. Give up all your other idols. He spends a little bit of time talking about meat, food that is sacrificed to idols. He says, don't worry about it. The idols have no power. They are nothing. Eat that food. But if you're with a believer who, because of conscience, won't eat it, don't try to correct them. Just don't eat it. The second thing he talks about in chapter 11, he talks about several issues of public worship. Now, the first part of the chapter, he talks about women and covering their head. There are those denominations today in which a woman will always cover her head in their church because of this passage. Well, what Paul is doing, he's looking at a Jewish congregation where in the synagogue, men would go inside and worship. Women would sit either outside the synagogue or sometime in a separate room in the synagogue. Frequently, they wouldn't even pay attention to what the men were doing. They would simply talk among themselves. Among the Greeks, women would come to offer sacrifices. They would always have their head uncovered when they did. We have statues from the time, paintings from the time. And when a woman makes a sacrifice to a false god, she would take whatever was on her head and uncover it. Paul said, I want us to cover our heads. What's he doing? He's saying, don't worship like the Jews do. Women, pay attention. Don't worship like the Gentiles do. Women, cover your head. Our worship is different. Then at the end of the chapter, he talks about how to celebrate the Lord's Supper. Now, starting in chapter 12, Paul begins talking about spiritual gifts. He finishes that up in chapter 14, but in the middle of it, he has 1 Corinthians 13. We call it the love chapter, an entire chapter dedicated to a beautiful poem about love. What in the world is going on here? Paul makes the observation that the way the Corinthian church is practicing spiritual gifts They are becoming fragmented and divided. He said God gave us the spiritual gifts to unite us. Use the gifts for unity, not for division. In fact, in the middle of his teaching on spiritual gifts, Paul says, if I have the gift of prophecy, but I don't have love, I have nothing. If I speak tongues, tongues of angels, tongues of men, but I don't have love, I'm nothing. Whatever I do is like a clanging cymbal, a gong, if I don't have love. Love binds all together. What Paul is saying, actually in all 3 chapters, all 5 chapters, the most important thing for the church is its unity, is that the church learn to love each other, whether that's in how they worship or whether that is in who they worship or how they use the gifts that our God has given us. We do it in love. We do it in unity. Like, follow, and subscribe to this devotional on whatever platform you use to listen to it. Tomorrow, we'll answer the question, what happens when we die?